The first snowflake that fell on Lillian Rose's face the morning her husband died should have been beautiful. But instead, it felt like a cruel promise of the hardship to come. She stood in the doorway of their small cabin just outside Unionville, Montana territory, watching the men from town carry Thomas's body away on a makeshift stretcher. He had been thrown from his horse 3 days prior, his neck broken in an instant, leaving Lillian a widow at 23 years old. The November wind cut through her shawl as she wrapped her arms around herself, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. The mountains in the distance were already white with snow, and the sky hung heavy with the promise of more to come. Thomas had been a good man, if not particularly affectionate. Their marriage had been one of practicality more than passion. He was 10 years her senior, a hard-working rancher who needed a wife, and she had been a young woman with no family and few prospects after her parents succumbed to illness 2 years before. They had built a life together over the past 3 years, one based on mutual respect and quiet companionship. But now he was gone, and Lillian found herself staring at a brutal Montana winter with dwindling supplies, no family, and a small ranch she had no idea how to maintain alone. The funeral was held 2 days later in the small church in Unionville. The town itself was modest, established just 15 years earlier in 1869 as a mining settlement that had gradually transformed into a ranching community. About 200 souls called it home, and perhaps half of them showed up to pay their respects to Thomas Rose. They offered Lillian their condolences with sympathetic looks and gentle pats on her shoulder, but she could see the concern in their eyes. A woman alone on a ranch in winter was a recipe for disaster. "You should come stay with us, Mrs. Peterson said after the service, her round face creased with worry. She and her husband ran the general store in town. "At least until spring. That cabin is too far out and you cannot manage all alone." Lillian appreciated the offer, but something in her rebelled at the thought. "I will manage," she said quietly. "Thomas and I worked hard on that land. I cannot just abandon it." Mrs. Peterson exchanged a glance with her husband. "Dear, there is no shame in accepting help. Winter here is not forgiving." "I know," Lillian said, "but it is my home. I need to at least try." She knew they thought she was being foolish, and perhaps she was. But that little cabin and the 40 acres surrounding it were all she had left in the world. If she gave it up now, she would truly have nothing. The first 2 weeks after the funeral passed in a blur of work. Lillian threw herself into the tasks Thomas had always handled, learning as she went. She fed the 6 cattle they owned, mucked out the small barn, chopped wood until her hands blistered, and tried to repair a section of fence that had come loose. Her body ached in ways she had never experienced, and each night she fell into bed exhausted, too tired even for tears. But it was not enough. She knew it was not enough. The woodpile was not as large as it should be, and she could not chop fast enough to build it up. The beef they had stored would not last the winter without supplementing it with fresh game, and she had never been a particularly good shot with Thomas's rifle. The roof needed repairs in 2 places before the heavy snows came, and she did not have the strength or the knowledge to do it properly. December arrived with a vengeance. The temperatures plummeted, and snow began to fall in earnest. Lillian found herself burning through wood faster than she had anticipated, trying to keep the cabin warm enough to survive. She rationed her food carefully, making thin soups and eating sparingly, knowing she had to make everything last. The cattle needed constant care, and breaking the ice on their water trough each morning became a brutal ritual that left her fingers numb despite her gloves. Loneliness settled over her like a heavy blanket. Days would pass without her speaking to another human being. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the howling wind and the occasional cry of a distant wolf. She had never realized how much Thomas's presence had filled the space, even though they had not been particularly talkative people. Just knowing someone else was there, another heartbeat in the darkness, had been a comfort she had taken for granted. On Christmas Eve, she sat alone by the fire, thinking about her parents and Thomas, and wondering how her life had brought her to this moment. She was not prone to self-pity, but the weight of her solitude pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. 23 years old, and her life felt over, reduced to mere survival in a harsh land that did not care whether she lived or died. The day after Christmas, the weather turned worse. A blizzard swept down from the mountains, howling around the cabin with such ferocity that Lillian feared the structure might collapse. For 3 days, she could do nothing but huddle by the fire, listening to the wind scream and watching her woodpile dwindle. The cattle would have to fend for themselves, and she could only pray they survived in the barn. When the storm finally passed, she forced herself outside to assess the damage. The snow had drifted as high as her waist in places, and she had to dig a path to the barn. 3 of the 6 cattle had survived. She stood looking at the frozen bodies of the others and felt something inside her crack. She had failed. Thomas had entrusted her with his life's work, and she was watching it crumble around her. That night, she allowed herself to cry for the first time since the funeral. Great, heaving sobs that shook her whole body as she knelt on the floor of the cabin. She cried for Thomas, for her parents, for her lost youth, for the life she had thought she would have. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she simply sat in the silence, numb and empty. January brought no relief. If anything, the cold intensified. Lillian's supplies were running dangerously low. She had not been to town since before Christmas, the journey too treacherous in the deep snow. Her last attempt to hunt had been unsuccessful, and she had wasted precious ammunition in the process. The 3 remaining cattle were thin, and she knew they would not make it through the winter at this rate. She started skipping meals, telling herself she was not that hungry, even as her dresses began to hang loose on her frame. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, never leaving even when she was pressed close to the fire. She developed a cough that rattled in her chest and left her weak and dizzy. By mid-January, she knew she was in serious trouble. She had perhaps 2 weeks of wood left if she was very conservative, and even less food. The journey to town on foot would take hours in the snow, and she was not sure she had the strength for it. But staying here meant certain death. She was trying to decide what to do, sitting at her small table with her head in her hands when she heard it. The sound of hoofbeats crunching through snow. Her heart leaped into her throat. It could be anyone out there, and a woman alone was vulnerable in ways she tried not to think about. But it could also be help, and she desperately needed help. Lillian grabbed Thomas's rifle from above the fireplace, checking to make sure it was loaded. Her hands trembled, whether from fear or weakness she could not say. The hoofbeats stopped outside her cabin, and then came the sound of boots on her porch. She waited, the rifle heavy in her arms, pointed at the door. The knock, when it came, was firm but not aggressive. Then a voice, deep and steady, called out, "Hello, is anyone home? I saw smoke from the chimney." Lillian hesitated. The voice sounded young, masculine, and genuinely concerned, but she had heard stories of what happened to isolated women on the frontier. "Who are you?" she called back, pleased that her voice sounded stronger than she felt. "My name is Xavier Owens, madam. I am a ranch hand from the Circle Bar spread about 20 miles north of here. I have been checking on homesteads after the storm, making sure folks are all right. Mrs. Peterson in town asked me to ride out this way, said there was a widow alone who might need help." Lillian lowered the rifle slightly. She knew the Circle Bar Ranch by reputation. It was one of the larger operations in the area, and they had a decent reputation. And Mrs. Peterson would not have sent someone she did not trust. "I am fine," she lied, her pride refusing to let her admit the truth to a stranger. There was a pause. "Madam, I do not mean to be forward, but I can see your woodpile from here, and it is not going to last you another week, and your barn has some damage from the storm. I would feel better if I could just see with my own eyes that you are all right." Lillian bit her lip. Every instinct told her to send him away, to maintain her independence, to not accept charity. But the rational part of her brain knew she was dying out here, slowly but surely. And this man, this Xavier Owens, had ridden out in the brutal cold to check on people. That spoke to his character. She set the rifle aside and opened the door. The man on her porch was younger than she had expected, probably close to her own age. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat and eyes the color of a summer sky. His face was wind-burned and dusted with snow, but his expression was open and concerned. He held his hat in his hands respectfully, and his horse, a sturdy sorrel gelding, stood patiently behind him. "Mrs. Rose?" he asked gently. "Yes," she said, suddenly aware of how she must look. She had not properly bathed in weeks. Her dress was stained and worn, and she knew she looked half-starved because that was exactly what she was. His eyes took in her appearance, and she saw a genuine worry flash across his face. "Madam, when was the last time you ate a proper meal?" "I have been eating," she said defensively. "That was not what I asked." His voice was kind but firm. "May I come in? It is powerful cold out here." She stepped aside and he entered, bringing with him the smell of horses and leather and the outdoors. He looked around the small cabin, and she saw him notice the meager stack of wood by the fireplace, the bare cupboards visible through the open shelving, the thin blankets on the bed. "Mrs. Rose, I do not mean any disrespect, but you are in a bad way here." "I can manage," she said automatically. Even though they both knew it was not true, he turned to face her, and his expression was serious. "Mrs. Peterson told me about your husband. I am truly sorry for your loss. But, madam, you are going to die out here if you do not accept some help. And I do not think your husband would want that." The blunt words hit her like a physical blow, perhaps because they were true. She swayed slightly, and he was at her side in an instant, his hand under her elbow, steadying her. "When did you last eat?" he asked again. "Yesterday morning," she admitted quietly. "I had some cornmeal mush." He looked at her for a long moment, then helped her to a chair. "You stay right here. I have supplies on my horse." Before she could protest, he was back outside. He returned a few minutes later with saddlebags that he set on the table. From them, he pulled out bread, cheese, dried beef, coffee, and a canteen. "This is yours," she started to say, but he held up a hand. "I brought it for you. Mrs. Peterson sent it, and some other folks in town contributed." He was already stoking the fire, adding wood from his own supplies. "Now, let me make you something to eat, and then we are going to talk about what needs to happen here." Lillian wanted to argue, but she was too tired and too hungry. She watched as he moved efficiently around her small kitchen, slicing bread and cheese, heating up some of the beef. Within minutes, he set a plate in front of her that held more food than she had seen in weeks. "Eat slowly," he cautioned. "Your stomach will not be used to it." She forced herself to follow his advice, even though she wanted to devour everything on the plate. The food was like heaven, and she had to blink back tears at the simple kindness of it. While she ate, Xavier made coffee and then excused himself to go tend to his horse and check on her barn. When he came back in, his expression was grim. "You lost 3 cattle in the storm." "I know," she said quietly. "The other 3 are not in good shape. Your barn has a leak in the roof and part of the north wall is damaged. It is a wonder they survived at all." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "Madam, I know you do not know me, and I know this is forward, but I cannot in good conscience ride away and leave you here to die. So here is what is going to happen. I am going to spend the next few days getting this place in shape. I will fix your barn, chop you enough wood to last the rest of winter, and help you get your remaining cattle healthy again. Mrs. Peterson sent enough food to last you through March, and I will make sure you know how to hunt well enough to supplement it." "I cannot pay you," Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper. "I am not asking for payment," Xavier said simply. "I am asking you to let me help because it is the right thing to do, because I could not sleep at night knowing I left you out here alone, because that is what people do in these parts. We look after each other." Lillian looked at this stranger who had appeared on her doorstep like an answer to prayers she had not even known how to speak. "Why?" she whispered. "You do not even know me." His blue eyes met hers, and she saw nothing but sincerity in them. "Maybe that is exactly why," he said. "Because sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones nobody knows well enough to help. Because I lost my own mother when I was 15, and I remember what it was like to feel that alone. Because it is January in Montana, and nobody should have to face that by themselves." Something in his words broke through the wall she had built around herself. She felt tears spill down her cheeks, and this time she did not try to stop them. "I am so tired," she admitted. "I have been trying so hard, but it is never enough. Every day is a battle just to survive, and I do not know how much longer I can keep fighting." Xavier reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and solid and real. "Then let me fight alongside you," he said simply. "Not anymore, Mrs. Rose. You are not alone anymore." Those words, "not anymore," settled into her chest like a warm coal, pushing back against the cold that had taken up residence there. She looked at their joined hands, his work roughened and strong, hers thin and covered with healing blisters. She should pull away, she knew. It was not proper for a widow to hold hands with a man she had just met, but she could not bring herself to let go of that connection, that lifeline he was offering. "All right," she whispered. "All right." Xavier squeezed her hand once more, then released it. "Good. Now, you are going to finish that food and then get some rest. You look like you have not slept properly in weeks. I am going to set up in your barn for tonight, and tomorrow we will start getting this place back in order." "You cannot sleep in the barn," Lillian protested. "It is too cold, and with the damage, it is not safe." "I have slept in worse places," Xavier assured her. "And it would not be proper for me to stay in the house with you. People talk, and you do not need that kind of trouble." She knew he was right, but the thought of him suffering in the cold barn when there was a warm fire right here bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Still, he was thinking of her reputation, which was more than many men would do. "There are extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed," she said. "And take some of the firewood. You can build a small fire out there if you are careful." He nodded. "I will be fine, I promise. You just focus on resting." After he left, carrying blankets and wood, Lillian sat in the quiet cabin and tried to process what had just happened. A stranger had appeared at her door and offered her hope when she had been certain there was none left. Xavier Owens. She repeated the name in her mind, testing it out. There was something about him, something solid and dependable, that made her want to trust him. His eyes held a kindness that seemed genuine, and he had not looked at her with pity or with the predatory interest she had feared. He had simply seen someone who needed help and offered it without expectation of anything in return. She finished her food slowly, savoring every bite, then added more wood to the fire from the stack Xavier had brought in. The cabin was warmer than it had been in weeks. For the first time since Thomas died, She went to bed without that gnawing anxiety in her stomach, without the certainty that she would not survive the winter. She pulled the thin blankets around herself and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, she woke to the sound of an axe striking wood. Weak sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window, and she could see her breath in the cold air. She quickly dressed and rekindled the fire, then made coffee with the supplies Xavier had brought. When she peered outside, she saw him in the yard, working steadily at chopping wood. He had already created a substantial pile, his movements efficient and rhythmic. Lillian watched him for a moment, noticing the way he moved with easy strength, never wasting motion. He had shed his heavy coat despite the cold, working in just his shirt and vest. She felt something stir in her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not quite attraction, not yet, but it was the recognition that he was a good man, and good men were rare. She poured a second cup of coffee and brought it out to him. He looked up when he heard the door, and his face broke into a smile that transformed his features from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip slightly. "Morning, Mrs. Rose," he said, setting down the axe and accepting the coffee gratefully. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted. "Thank you for all of this." "No need to thank me," he said, taking a sip of the coffee. "This is good coffee." "It is your coffee," she pointed out. "Well then, you made it good." His eyes held a hint of humor, and she found herself almost smiling in return, something she had not done since before Thomas died. They stood there in the quiet morning, drinking coffee and watching the sun try to break through the heavy clouds. It was strange, Lillian thought, how comfortable this felt, as though they had known each other for years rather than mere hours. "I was thinking," Xavier said after a moment, "once I get enough wood chopped to see you through, I should teach you how to use that rifle properly. There is still good hunting to be had if you know where to look, and you will need fresh meat." "I am not a very good shot," Lillian confessed. "Thomas tried to teach me, but I never quite got the hang of it." "That is all right. It just takes practice and patience. And maybe a teacher who is not your husband." He said the last part gently. "Sometimes it is easier to learn from someone who does not have expectations of you already." She considered this. "You are probably right. Thomas was always frustrated that I could not seem to master it." "Well, I promise not to get frustrated," Xavier said. "Everyone learns at their own pace." He set down his empty cup and picked up the axe again. "I should get back to this. The more I can get done while the weather holds, the better." Lillian returned to the cabin and spent the morning organizing the supplies Xavier had brought, taking inventory and planning how to make everything last. It was amazing how much lighter she felt knowing she did not have to ration quite so severely, knowing there was enough. She baked bread using the flour he had brought, and the smell that filled the cabin was like comfort itself. At midday, she called him in for lunch. They ate bread and cheese and dried beef, and she learned more about him. Xavier was 24 years old, originally from Kansas. His father had been a farmer who had lost everything to drought and grasshoppers when Xavier was 14. His mother had died from pneumonia the following winter, and his father had drunk himself to death within a year after that. Xavier had been on his own since 16, working as a ranch hand wherever he could find work. "That is why I check on folks after storms," he told her. "I remember what it was like to be alone and struggling, with nobody to help. If I can spare someone else that feeling, then I will do it." "You are a good man, Xavier Owens," Lillian said softly. He looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I just try to do right when I can." "That is more than many people do," she said. That afternoon, he worked on repairing the barn while she tended to the 3 remaining cattle. Xavier had brought grain for them, and they ate eagerly. She stood in the barn, listening to Xavier hammer and saw above her head, and felt something she had not felt in months. She felt hope. Over the next several days they fell into a rhythm. Xavier would arrive at first light and work until dark, fixing everything that needed fixing, building up the woodpile, tending to tasks that Lillian could not manage alone. She would cook for them both, meals that were still simple but more substantial than anything she had eaten in weeks. Slowly, she could feel her strength returning, both physical and emotional. They talked while they worked, sharing stories of their lives. Lillian told him about her parents, about their little farm in Illinois, and how she had loved helping her mother with the garden. She told him about meeting Thomas, about how he had been kind to her when she had nobody, even if their marriage had been more practical than passionate. "Did you love him?" Xavier asked one evening as they sat by the fire after a long day of work. Lillian considered the question carefully. "I cared for him deeply," she said finally. "I respected him and I was grateful to him. But love, the kind of love people write poems about, no, I do not think we had that. We had partnership, and that was enough." Xavier nodded slowly. "My parents had that kind of love," he said quietly. "The poem kind. You could see it in the way they looked at each other, the way they would touch hands as they passed each other. I remember thinking I would not settle for anything less than that." "Have you found it?" Lillian asked. He looked at her across the fire, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "I am starting to think I might have," he said softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Lillian knew she should say something, should acknowledge what he was implying, but she could not find the words. It was too soon, surely. She was a widow of barely 2 months. People would talk. It was not proper, but when had anything in her life been proper? And why should she care what people thought when this man had literally saved her life? "Xavier," she started, but he held up a hand. "You do not have to say anything," he said. "I know it is too soon. I just wanted you to know how I feel, but there is no pressure, Lillian. Can I call you Lillian?" "Yes," she whispered, realizing it was the first time he had used her given name. "And you should know that I value your friendship more than I can say. You came into my life when I had given up hope, and you gave me a reason to keep fighting. That means everything to me. But—" he prompted gently. "But I need time," she said. "I need to figure out who I am without Thomas, without being defined by being someone's wife. And I need to grieve properly, something I have not allowed myself to do because I was too busy trying to survive." Xavier nodded, and there was no hurt in his expression, only understanding. "Take all the time you need. I will be here as a friend for as long as you need me." The next morning brought warmer weather, a brief reprieve from the bitter cold. Xavier suggested they use the opportunity for him to teach her to shoot properly. They walked out into the meadow behind the cabin, where he set up targets against a snowbank. "The key is not to fight the rifle," he explained, showing her how to hold it properly, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. "You work with it, not against it. And you have to trust yourself. Second-guessing is what throws off your aim." He stood behind her, his arms bracketing hers as he helped her position the rifle. Lillian was intensely aware of his presence, the warmth of his body, the steady sound of his breathing. It made her nervous in a way that had nothing to do with the rifle. "Relax," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "You are tensing up. Just breathe." She forced herself to relax into the stance, to focus on the target rather than on how close Xavier was. She breathed in, breathed out, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, but she was braced for it this time. The shot went wide of the target, but not by much. "Better," Xavier said, stepping back. "Try again on your own this time." She reloaded and tried again, and again, and again. By the time they finished, she had actually hit the target twice, and she felt ridiculously proud of herself. "You are a natural," Xavier said with a grin. "A few more practice sessions and you will be bringing down elk." "Let us not get ahead of ourselves," Lillian said, but she was smiling. "I will settle for rabbits." They walked back to the cabin together, and Lillian realized she was genuinely happy in this moment. When had that happened? When had she gone from merely surviving to actually living again? 2 weeks after Xavier first appeared at her door, the Circle Bar foreman came by to check on him. The man, a grizzled cowboy named Pete, looked surprised to find Xavier still there. "Boss is wondering when you are planning to come back," Pete said, eyeing the neat stacks of firewood and the repaired barn. "Looks like you have got things well in hand here." "Just want to make sure everything is secure before I leave," Xavier said. Pete glanced at Lillian, then back at Xavier, and something knowing crossed his face. "Right. Well, boss says take your time, but we could use you back when you are ready." After Pete left, Xavier looked uncomfortable. "I should probably head back soon," he said. "I have been here longer than I intended and they need me at the ranch." Lillian felt her heart sink, which was absurd. She had known he could not stay forever. He had his own life, his own responsibilities. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "You have done so much already." "I cannot thank you enough." "Lillian," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. "I do not want to leave, I want you to know that, but I need the work and I cannot just abandon my obligations." "I understand," she said, and she did. "When will you go?" "Day after tomorrow, I think. That will give me time to make sure you have everything you need." The next 2 days passed too quickly. Xavier made sure the woodpile was stacked high, that the barn was secure, that the cattle were healthy. He took Lillian hunting and helped her bring down a deer, showing her how to field dress it and preserve the meat. He left her with detailed instructions on everything she might need to know, and he made her practice with the rifle until he was satisfied she could handle herself. "The Circle Bar is about a 4-hour ride from here," he told her on his last evening. "If you need anything, anything at all, you send word and I will come. Or if you can make it to town, you can leave a message at the general store and Mrs. Peterson will get it to me." "I will be fine," Lillian said, trying to convince herself as much as him. They were sitting by the fire, the way they had done so many evenings over the past 2 weeks. But tonight felt different, weighted with the knowledge that tomorrow he would leave and she would be alone again. "I know you will be," Xavier said. "You are stronger than you think you are, Lillian Rose. These past weeks have proven that." "I could not have survived without you," she said quietly. "Maybe not. But you can survive now, and that is what matters." He was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I am going to come back and visit when I can, if that is all right with you." "I would like that," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "And maybe, when enough time has passed, when you have had time to grieve and to figure out who you are, maybe we can see if this thing between us is real." He looked at her then, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Because I think it is, Lillian. I think what I feel for you is real and true and worth waiting for." Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. "I think so too," she whispered. "But I need time. Is that selfish of me?" "No," he said firmly. "It is honest. And I would rather wait for something real than rush into something we are not ready for." He left the next morning, and Lillian stood in the doorway watching him ride away, feeling like part of her was leaving with him. The cabin felt enormous and empty without his presence, and she had to fight the urge to call him back, to ask him to stay just one more day. But she did not, because he was right. She needed time to figure herself out, to stand on her own 2 feet. She needed to know she could survive without him before she could truly be with him. The weeks after Xavier left were hard, but not in the same desperate way they had been before. Lillian threw herself into the work of maintaining the ranch, taking pride in each task she completed. She hunted successfully, bringing down rabbits and even another deer. She kept the cattle healthy and made sure the barn stayed in good repair. She chopped wood and hauled water and did all the things that needed doing. And slowly, gradually, she began to feel like herself again. Not Thomas's wife. Not a grieving widow. Just Lillian, a woman who was strong enough to survive a Montana winter on her own. She thought about Xavier constantly. Every time she chopped wood, she remembered watching him do the same. Every time she practiced with the rifle, she remembered his patient instruction. Every evening by the fire, she remembered their conversations, the way he looked at her, the things he had said. February arrived, still cold but with the promise that winter would not last forever. Lillian made her first trip to town since before Christmas, riding one of Thomas's horses through the snow. Mrs. Peterson greeted her with tears in her eyes. "Oh, my dear, you look so much better," the older woman said, embracing her. "We were so worried." "But Xavier said you were doing well when Pete went to check on him." "Xavier saved my life," Lillian said simply. "He is a good boy," Mrs. Peterson agreed. "And he left word that if you came to town, I should tell you he will be by to visit in about 2 weeks. He gets a few days off every month, and he plans to spend them checking on you." Lillian's heart leaped at the news, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. She was not entirely successful because Mrs. Peterson gave her a knowing look. "It is all right to care for him, dear," the older woman said gently. "Nobody would fault you for finding happiness again." "It is too soon," Lillian protested weakly. "Perhaps, but the heart does not follow society's rules about what is proper, it just knows what it knows." Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. "You are young, Lillian. You have your whole life ahead of you. Thomas was a good man, but he is gone. You are allowed to live." Those words echoed in Lillian's mind during the ride back to the cabin. She was allowed to live. It seemed so simple, but it felt revolutionary. She had been so focused on surviving that she had forgotten about actually living, about allowing herself to feel joy and hope and maybe even love. The 2 weeks, until Xavier's visit, felt interminable. Lillian found herself preparing for his arrival, cleaning the cabin more thoroughly than necessary, baking bread, making sure everything was in order. She told herself she was just being a good host, but she knew it was more than that. She wanted him to see how well she was doing, how she had taken everything he taught her and used it to thrive rather than just survive. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching the cabin on a crisp February morning, her heart began to race. She smoothed down her dress, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and tried to calm her breathing before opening the door. Xavier stood on her porch, hat in hand, his face breaking into that smile that made her feel warm all over. "Hello, Lillian," he said softly. "Hello, Xavier," she said, and then they just stood there looking at each other, the air between them charged with everything unspoken. "Can I come in?" he asked finally. "Yes, of course." She stepped aside, suddenly nervous. It had only been a few weeks, but it felt like so much longer. "I made coffee and bread." "That sounds perfect." They sat at her small table, and Xavier told her about his work at the Circle Bar, about the other ranch hands and the cattle and the rhythm of ranch life. She told him about her hunting successes, about making it through several more storms, about her trip to town. But beneath the mundane conversation was a current of awareness, of possibility. Every time their eyes met, Lillian felt it. Every accidental brush of hands as they passed things across the table sent electricity through her. "You are doing really well," Xavier said after a while. "I can see it. You have got color in your cheeks again, and you are standing straighter. You look like someone who knows she can handle whatever comes." "I have a good teacher," Lillian said, "and a good friend." "Is that what I am?" Xavier asked quietly. "A friend? Lillian set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "I have been thinking about that," she said carefully. "About what you said before you left, about waiting to see if this is real." And his blue eyes were intent on her face. "And I think I do not want to wait any more," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it has not been very long since Thomas died. I know people will talk. But Xavier, you gave me my life back, and not just in the practical sense of keeping me alive. You reminded me that there is more to life than just surviving. You made me laugh again. You made me feel again. And I do not want to pretend that means nothing just because society says I should wait a certain amount of time." Xavier reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Because once we start down this road, there is no going back. People will talk and it might be hard. I do not want you to have regrets." "I am sure," Lillian said, and she was. For the first time in months, maybe years, she was absolutely certain about something. "I care about you, Xavier. I think I might even love you, though that terrifies me a bit. You are nothing like Thomas. You make me feel things I never felt before, and maybe that makes me a terrible person, but I cannot help it." "You are not a terrible person," Xavier said fiercely. "You are the bravest, strongest woman I have ever met, and for what it is worth, I love you too. I have loved you since that first day when you answered the door with that rifle in your hands, trying so hard to be strong when you were barely holding on. I loved you when you cried and admitted you needed help. I loved you when you stood in the snow and finally hit that target after missing 20 times. I love everything about you, Lillian Rose." Lillian felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears this time. Xavier stood up and pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, burying her face in his chest and breathing in the familiar smell of him. "I love you," she whispered against his shirt. "I love you so much." He tilted her face up and kissed her, gentle at first and then deeper, and it was like nothing Lillian had ever experienced before. Thomas had kissed her with distant affection, but this was different. This was passion and tenderness and promise all wrapped into one perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, and I know people will talk, but I do not care. I want to spend my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, right here on this land you fought so hard to keep. Marry me, Lillian." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Unionville. As Lillian had predicted, people talked. Some of the older women in town thought it was scandalous that she was remarrying so soon after Thomas's death. But others, including Mrs. Peterson, defended her fiercely. And when the townspeople saw how Xavier looked at Lillian, how he treated her with such obvious love and respect, most of the criticism died down. Xavier gave notice at the Circle Bar and moved into the cabin with Lillian. They spent the last weeks of winter working together to expand the ranch, using Xavier's savings to buy more cattle and supplies. They talked late into the night about their dreams and plans, about the life they wanted to build together. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers and green grass, and with it came a sense of renewal. Lillian planted a garden, something she had not had the energy or resources to do the previous year. Xavier built an addition onto the cabin, giving them more space. They worked side by side, partners in every sense of the word. The difference between her marriage to Thomas and her marriage to Xavier was stark. With Thomas, she had been a wife in the practical sense, someone to cook and clean and keep house. With Xavier, she was a true partner. He valued her opinions, asked for her input on decisions, and treated her as an equal. And the physical side of their marriage was a revelation. Lillian had never known that being with someone could be so passionate, so consuming, so absolutely right. "I never knew it could be like this," she confessed to him one night as they lay tangled together in their bed, the windows open to let in the cool spring air. "Like what?" Xavier asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Like this. Like I cannot imagine being without you. Like every moment together is precious." She turned to look at him in the moonlight. "Is this what it is supposed to feel like?" "Yes," he said simply. "This is what love is supposed to feel like." Summer brought long days of hard work but also moments of pure joy. They rode together through the mountains, swam in the creek that ran through their property, danced in the cabin to no music at all. Xavier taught Lillian things Thomas never had: how to rope cattle, how to break a horse to saddle, how to read the weather by the look of the sky. And Lillian taught Xavier too, about herbs and healing, about coaxing the best vegetables from stubborn Montana soil, about finding beauty in the smallest things. In August, Lillian realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses and felt queasy in the mornings, and when she confessed her suspicions to Xavier, he whooped with joy and spun her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Lillian asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Xavier said, pulling her close. "You have given me everything I never knew I wanted: a home, a life, a love that makes every day worth living, and now a child. Lillian, I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy was difficult at times. The morning sickness lasted well into her 5th month, and the summer heat made her swell uncomfortably. But Xavier was attentive and patient, taking on extra work so she could rest, rubbing her feet when they ached, holding her hair when she was sick. "You do not have to do all this," she told him one evening as he massaged her sore back. "I want to," he said simply. "You are carrying our child, our future. The least I can do is make sure you are as comfortable as possible." Fall arrived and brought with it cooler temperatures and the anticipation of their baby's arrival. Lillian spent her days preparing, making tiny clothes and blankets, organizing the corner of the cabin that would serve as a nursery. Xavier finished the addition just in time, giving them a separate bedroom and more space for their growing family. On a cold November night, almost exactly a year after Thomas had died, Lillian went into labor. Xavier rode to town through the darkness to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in Unionville. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but Xavier never left her side. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool cloths, whispered encouragement even when she was certain she could not go on. Finally, as the sun was setting on that November day, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry, red-faced and perfect. Mrs. Patterson cleaned him up and placed him in Lillian's arms, and both she and Xavier stared down at him in wonder. "He is beautiful," Xavier whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He looks like you," Lillian said, tracing the baby's tiny features with one finger. "He has your nose," Xavier countered, and they both laughed, giddy with exhaustion and joy. They named him Thomas Xavier Owens, honoring both the man who had given Lillian a home when she needed one and the man who had given her a life worth living. Little Tommy, as they called him, was a good baby, healthy and strong. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and both his parents were completely besotted with him. The winter that had nearly killed Lillian the year before now found her warm and safe and surrounded by love. She would sit by the fire nursing Tommy while Xavier carved small toys for him, and she would think about how much had changed in a single year. She had gone from utterly alone and certain she would not survive to having a husband she loved desperately and a beautiful son. Life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. "Do you ever think about that day?" Xavier asked her one evening. "The day I first knocked on your door." "All the time," Lillian admitted. "I was so close to giving up, Xavier. Another week and I do not think I would have made it." "You saved me." "We saved each other," he said, reaching over to take her hand. "I was just going through the motions before I met you. Working, existing, but not really living. You gave me something to live for, a reason to build a future instead of just surviving day to day." "When winter left me all alone," Lillian said softly, "you knocked on my door and said not anymore, and you meant it. You really meant it." "Of course I meant it," Xavier said, "and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face anything alone again." Time passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their growing family. Tommy took his first steps on a warm spring day, wobbling across the cabin floor into his father's waiting arms. He said his first word, which was "Da," much to Xavier's delight and Lillian's mock indignation. They celebrated his first birthday with a small party, inviting the neighbors and the Petersons from town. When Tommy was 2 years old, Lillian found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born on a beautiful May morning, coming into the world so quickly that Xavier barely had time to fetch Mrs. Patterson. They named her Lily Rose Owens, and she was as different from her brother as could be. Where Tommy was all energy and noise, Lily was quiet and observant, taking in the world with serious gray eyes. The ranch prospered under Xavier and Lillian's care. They slowly built their herd, and Xavier's reputation as a fair and hard-working rancher spread. Other ranchers began seeking his advice, and he was elected to the local cattlemen's association. Lillian's garden became the envy of the county, producing vegetables long after everyone else's had frozen. She began preserving and selling her produce in town, and the extra income allowed them to continue expanding. But more than material success, they built a life filled with love and laughter. Their cabin echoed with the sounds of children playing, of Xavier teaching Tommy to rope and Lillian teaching Lily her letters. They had friends in town and neighbors who became like family. They hosted barn dances and holiday dinners, and their home became known as a place where everyone was welcome. Years passed, and their family grew. 2 more children arrived, another boy they named Daniel, and then finally another girl, Rose, who was the baby of the family. The cabin expanded along with their family, additions being built until it was a proper ranch house. They added barns and outbuildings, and their land stretched far into the Montana wilderness. But through all the changes, one thing remained constant. The love between Lillian and Xavier never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. They still made time for each other, still talked late into the night, still looked at each other with the same passion and tenderness they had felt in those early days. On their 10th anniversary, Xavier took Lillian on a ride up into the mountains, just the 2 of them. They left the children with Mrs. Peterson and spent 2 days alone, camping under the stars and remembering what it had been like when it was just them. "You have any regrets?" Xavier asked her as they sat by their campfire on the second night. Lillian thought about the question carefully. "About us? Never, not for a single moment." She looked at him across the fire, this man who had quite literally saved her life. "I do sometimes wonder who I would have been if things had been different. If Thomas had not died, if you had not shown up at my door. Would I have stayed in that practical, passionless marriage? Would I have ever known what it was like to really love someone?" "We cannot know what might have been," Xavier said. We can only be grateful for what is. And I am grateful, Lillian said, for all of it, even for the hard times because they brought me to you. They made love under the stars that night, and it was as passionate and consuming as it had been the first time. When Lillian fell asleep in Xavier's arms, she thought about how lucky she was. Not everyone got a second chance at happiness. Not everyone got to know what real love felt like. The children grew, as children do. Tommy became a strapping young man who was the spitting image of his father, with the same blue eyes and easy smile. He had Xavier's way with horses and Lillian's stubborn determination. At 19, he married a girl from town, Sarah, and they built a cabin on the far edge of the ranch property, planning to raise their own family there. Lily grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's dark hair and a quiet strength that reminded everyone of Lillian. She loved books and learning, and at 18 she shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to go to the new normal school in Bozeman to become a teacher. Xavier and Lillian supported her dream, even though it meant she would be living away from home for the first time. Daniel was the wild one, always getting into scrapes and adventures. At 16, he announced he wanted to be a lawman, and Xavier arranged for him to apprentice with the county sheriff. Rose, the baby at 12, was still finding her way, but she showed promise as a rider and seemed to have inherited her father's way with animals. Lillian stood on the porch of their ranch house one evening, watching the sun set over the mountains and thinking about how far she had come. She was 43 years old now, and her dark hair was threaded with silver. Her hands were calloused from years of work, and her face bore the lines of a life well lived. But she was happy. Deeply, completely happy. Xavier came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different my life is from what I thought it would be," she said. "When I married Thomas, I thought I knew what my life would look like. A practical marriage, children maybe, hard work, and just getting by. I never imagined this. I never imagined being so happy." "I am glad I could surprise you," Xavier said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "You remember that day?" she asked. "The day you first came here?" "Of course," Xavier said. "You answered the door with a rifle, skinny as a rail and trying so hard to be brave. I fell in love with you right then, though I did not know it yet." "I thought I was going to die that winter," Lillian confessed. "I had accepted it. And then you knocked on my door and said I was not alone anymore. You kept that promise, Xavier. Every single day for the past 20 years you have kept that promise. And I will keep it for the rest of our lives," Xavier said, turning her to face him. "You and me, Lillian, until the very end." She kissed him then, this man who had given her everything, and felt the same flutter in her heart she had felt the first time they kissed. Some things never changed, and the love between them was one of those things. The years continued to roll by. Tommy and Sarah had 3 children, making Xavier and Lillian grandparents. Lily finished her schooling and took a position as a teacher in Unionville, where she met and married a banker named James. Daniel became a respected deputy sheriff, known for his fairness and his quick draw. Rose surprised everyone by becoming one of the best horse trainers in the territory, and people would travel for miles to have her work with their difficult animals. Xavier's hair turned silver, and he developed a slight limp from an old injury, but he still worked the ranch every day, now with Tommy and his grandsons by his side. Lillian's hands became more gnarled with arthritis, but she still tended her garden and helped with the grandchildren and maintained the household with quiet efficiency. They became pillars of the community, respected and loved. People would point them out to visitors, telling the story of how Xavier had saved widow Lillian Rose that terrible winter, and how they had built one of the most successful ranches in Montana territory. But more than that, people talked about how they still held hands when they walked through town, how Xavier still looked at Lillian like she was the most beautiful woman in the world, how they were an example of what true love looked like. On their 25th anniversary, the whole town threw them a party. It was held in the church social hall, and it seemed like everyone in the county showed up. There were speeches and toasts, and their children presented them with a beautiful quilt that had been made by all the women in the family, each square telling a story from their years together. "I never expected this," Lillian whispered to Xavier as they danced to the music provided by a local fiddler. "I never expected any of this. Life has a way of surprising us," Xavier said, pulling her closer. "The woman I married was broken and grieving, barely surviving. Look at you now. Strong, confident, loved by everyone who knows you. You did that, Lillian. You chose to live instead of just existing." "We did that," she corrected. "Together." As they danced, Lillian thought about the path that had brought her here. If someone had told that desperate, starving widow that in 25 years she would be dancing at her anniversary party, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends, married to a man who loved her more than life itself, she would not have believed it. Life could change so quickly, from despair to hope, from loneliness to love. Montana Territory became Montana State in 1889, and Xavier and Lillian were there for the celebration in Unionville. They watched as the American flag was raised with the new star representing their state, and they felt pride in being part of this wild, beautiful place they called home. More years passed. They celebrated 30 years of marriage, then 35. Their children all married and had families of their own. The ranch continued to prosper, now with the third generation beginning to take on responsibilities. Xavier and Lillian gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations, content to spend their time with each other and their grandchildren. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains and talk about everything and nothing. They still laughed together, still reached for each other in the night, still found joy in the simple fact of being together. "You ever think about that winter?" Xavier asked one evening. They were in their 60s now, their hair completely silver, their faces lined with age. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been. "All the time," Lillian said. "Not with sadness, but with gratitude. Because that terrible winter brought me you, and you brought me life. When winter left you all alone," Xavier said softly, "I knocked on your door and said not anymore," Lillian finished. "And you meant it. You have kept me company through every season since then. You have been my partner, my love, my best friend. And I will be until my last breath," Xavier promised. They lived to see the new century arrive. On January 1st, 1900, they stood with their children and grandchildren and watched fireworks light up the sky over Unionville. It felt momentous, standing on the edge of a new era, knowing they had been part of building this place, this community, this family. "We have had a good life," Lillian said to Xavier that night as they prepared for bed. "The best life," Xavier agreed. "I would not change a single thing." "Not even that first terrible winter?" Lillian asked with a slight smile. "Especially not that winter," Xavier said, "because it brought us together, and that made everything worth it." They lived many more years, growing old together with grace and dignity. Xavier's health began to fail first. At 71, he developed a weak heart that left him breathless and tired. But he refused to slow down completely, still rising each morning to help with the ranch work, still sitting on the porch with Lillian each evening. "You should rest more," Lillian scolded him gently one day after he returned from a long ride to check on the cattle. "I will have plenty of time to rest when I am dead," Xavier said, but his smile was gentle. "Right now, I want to live every moment I have left." "Do not talk about dying," Lillian said, even though they both knew it was coming. They were in their 70s and they had lived full, hard lives. Death was not something to fear, but it was still something to mourn. "I am not afraid," Xavier told her, taking her hand. "I have lived a life beyond my wildest dreams. I have loved you and been loved by you for more than 40 years. I have children and grandchildren who will carry on after me. What more could any man want?" Lillian could not argue with that, but it did not stop her from cherishing every moment they had left together. Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold February night. Lillian beside him as she had been every night for the past 42 years. She woke to find him still and cold, and her heart broke even as she was grateful he had not suffered. He had simply closed his eyes one last time and slipped away. The funeral was huge, people coming from all over Montana to pay their respects. Xavier Owens had been a respected rancher, a devoted father and grandfather, and a pillar of the community. But more than that, he had been a good man, the kind of man who would ride out in the middle of winter to check on a widow he did not know, the kind of man who would spend his life making sure the woman he loved knew she was cherished. Lillian grieved deeply, but without the desperate despair she had felt when Thomas died. This was different. She had loved Xavier with every fiber of her being, and his loss left a hole in her heart that would never fully heal. But she had no regrets. They had built a beautiful life together, had loved each other well, and had left a legacy that would continue for generations. She lived 3 more years after Xavier's death, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, tending her garden and sitting on the porch looking at the mountains. People worried about her being alone, but Lillian did not feel alone. She felt Xavier's presence everywhere, in every corner of the ranch they had built together, in the faces of their descendants, in the whisper of the wind through the trees. On a warm May morning, just after her 76th birthday, Lillian Rose Owens passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her children found her in bed, a slight smile on her face as though she had been dreaming of something beautiful. Perhaps she had been dreaming of Xavier, of being reunited with him at last. They buried her next to Xavier in the small cemetery outside Unionville, under a tree they had planted together years ago. The headstones were simple but elegant, bearing their names and the dates of their births and deaths. But someone, probably one of their grandchildren, had added an inscription below their names. When Winter left her all alone, he knocked on her door and said, "Not anymore, together forever." The ranch continued to thrive under Tommy and his children, and then his grandchildren. The story of Xavier and Lillian became family legend, passed down through the generations. Great-grandchildren who never met them would hear about the terrible winter that had nearly claimed Lillian's life, about Xavier riding through the snow to help a woman he did not know, about the love that had grown between them and lasted until their last breaths. And in Unionville, Montana, people still told the story too. It became part of the town's history, a reminder that even in the hardest times, even when winter leaves you all alone and cold and certain you will not survive, hope can arrive. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a cowboy knocking on your door, offering help and eventually offering love. The ranch house still stood 100 years later, restored and maintained by descendants who understood its significance. The porch where Xavier and Lillian had spent so many evenings still overlooked the same mountains. The trees they had planted still grew tall and strong. And sometimes, local people swore they could see 2 figures on that porch in the evening light, sitting close together, holding hands, watching the sunset over Montana's wild, beautiful landscape. It was a love story that had started with desperation and survival, but it had grown into something legendary. A reminder that the best things in life often come when you least expect them, that love can bloom even in the harshest conditions, and that a promise made in earnest, a promise that you are not alone anymore, can change everything. Xavier and Lillian's story became a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of showing up for others, and the transformative nature of true love. They had taken the worst winter could throw at them and turned it into a lifetime of warmth. They had faced hardship and loss and the daily struggles of frontier life, but they had faced it all together, and that had made all the difference. Their descendants carried pieces of them forward. Tommy's great-grandson had Xavier's blue eyes and his way with horses. Lily's great-granddaughter had Lillian's love of learning and her green thumb. Daniel's great-grandson became a lawman like him, known for fairness and integrity. Rose's great-granddaughter became a veterinarian, carrying on the family tradition of working with animals. But more than physical traits or career paths, they carried forward the values Xavier and Lillian had instilled. The importance of hard work and perseverance, the value of community and helping your neighbors, the belief that love, true love, was worth fighting for and worth building a life around. The understanding that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances, if you are just brave enough to keep going. The story of when winter left her all alone, and the cowboy knocked on her door and said, "Not anymore," lived on. It was told at family gatherings and town celebrations. It was written down and preserved in the local historical society. It became part of the fabric of Unionville, Montana, a reminder of the town's roots and the kind of people who had built it. And perhaps most importantly, it remained a love story for the ages. Not a fairy tale with impossible beauty and perfect circumstances, but a real story about real people who found each other when they needed each other most. About a woman who learned she was stronger than she ever imagined. About a man who saw someone who needed help and offered it without expecting anything in return. About two people who fell in love slowly and deeply and built a life that mattered. It was a story that proved love could survive anything, from brutal Montana winters to the passage of time. A story that showed how one moment, one decision, one person showing up when you need them most, can change the entire trajectory of your life. A story that reminded everyone who heard it that they were never truly alone, that help could come from unexpected places, and that love, real and true and deep, was always worth waiting for. Xavier and Lillian Owens lived and loved and left a legacy that extended far beyond the acres they had ranched or the children they had raised. They left a story of hope and resilience, and the kind of love that poets write about and everyone dreams of finding. And their story, begun on a desperate winter day when a cowboy knocked on a widow's door, would live on forever in the hearts of all who heard it.